Welcome to another video from Ta Ethne. I hope that this will richly bless you and that God will continue to shower His mercy and grace upon you all. We're going to be looking at the book of Habakkuk tonight. The book of Habakkuk is one of the so-called minor prophets. This doesn't mean that he's less important. It means that his book is shorter than most of the other prophets in the Old Testament. It's only 3 chapters long. It's near the end of the Old Testament. And we're not going to read the entire book. You have plenty of time to do that on your own. What I would like to do, though, is focus this on frustration. And what do you do when you're frustrated with God? Because the prophet Habakkuk was frustrated with God. There was a problem that he saw. He understood God's character, and he couldn't understand why God's holiness did not allow him to address the problem that Habakkuk saw. And so this is something that I think plagues a lot of us as believers. We see things going on in the world. We see injustice. We see wrongs. We see evil. And we wonder, because we know God's character, we know God's holiness, we wonder why God doesn't act, why God doesn't do something. And we get very, very frustrated a lot of times at God. And even more so, sometimes we've been told that we can't get frustrated at God. Well, you can. Because we are of limited intelligence as far as being compared to God Almighty. And there's some things we just don't understand. And when you don't understand something that you want to understand, you get frustrated. So let's just look at some key things here out of the book of Habakkuk. You can trust you've had time maybe to open up your Bibles and to turn there. And in Habakkuk chapter 1, we find that Habakkuk kind of has a problem. And in verse 1 of chapter 1, it says that he has a burden. This is something that is weighing on his heart. It's weighing on his mind, and he has to speak about it. This is the burden, it says, which the prophet Habakkuk saw. And we don't know exactly when Habakkuk was alive. We know it was probably sometime between the time the Babylonian Empire conquered Assyria and before they came and conquered Jerusalem. Probably he lived around the time of King Josiah and then later. So he would have saw Israel at one of its spiritual heights in the revival under King Josiah. But now he's lived long enough that the country's in terrible spiritual decline, and he's worried about it. He's bothered about it. He has a problem with God's people acting the way that they were acting in there. And so it's the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw, not just a burden in the sense that this was a message from God, although it was a very personal message, as a matter of fact, as well as being a national message. But it's a burden that he had personally trying to wrestle with this problem, and he's very, very frustrated. It's kind of funny. The name Habakkuk means to embrace or to cling to something, and we see that he does cling to God in this. And we'll even see he's willing to embrace the unknown. Very, very interesting, his name. The burden that Habakkuk the prophet saw, "O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear me? Yet I even cry out to you, violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble?" And then he lists the things that are going on in the country that he sees. He says, "For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore perverse judgment proceeds." And as he starts off in verse 2 and he says, "Oh Lord, how long shall I cry?" This is truly a word that means it is a cry of frustration. He is screaming out to God. He is so bothered by this. This isn't some little mealy-mouthed prayer. "Oh Lord, you see the country's in a bad shape and I wonder what you do with it." No, he is bothered by this. He is screaming out his frustration. "Lord, why do you show me the horrible things going on in the country and you're not doing anything about it?" And not just the country as a whole. In his list of things that he puts down, there are some personal issues that he sees in individual people, as well as this whole corporate sin thing that is going on, this miasma, this cloud of sin that seems to have enveloped the entire country. And he says, I'm crying out to you that there's violence going on. Horrible violence among your people, among God's people are going on, and you're doing nothing that I can see. He says, why do you show me the sins of people to preach about if you're not going to do anything about it? Why do you burden me with seeing all these wrongs? Why do you cause me to see this trouble? Why are you revealing what's going on in my nation and in the world around me at this time if you're not going to act? I see plundering. I see violence. Plundering is taking something from someone that you have made helpless, that you have defeated. And we see that going on in our country this time too, plundering and violence, people taking stuff that is not theirs through force and through violence. There's strife and contention arises. People are at each other's throats, are arguing over everything. The country is divided in his day as well as in our day. The country's about split 50-50 on most things, it seems like. The law is powerless. He feels so helpless. He says even when people are taken before the law, when they're caught, the law is powerless to stop them. And that's true, really. You can pass all the laws you want, but it's not going to change people's hearts. You're not going to change their hearts. The law is powerless to stop people beforehand. All the law can do is punish people after the fact. But then he says justice never goes forth. It doesn't matter if they're called or not. They're not going to get justice. They're going to be let off the hook, whether they're buying their way out or people just simply don't care. He says justice is not going forth. The wicked are surrounding the righteous. They outnumber us, he says. The few that want to do righteous are far less in number than those who are wicked. Does this not sound familiar? Well, what a more appropriate message could there be for 2020 in America than to look at Habakkuk? And you are probably frustrated like Habakkuk, as asking God, why are you not doing something? Don't you care about your people? Why are you revealing all this stuff to us if you're not going to act, if you're not going to do anything? Perverse judgment proceeds even when somebody goes to court and there's a judgment rendered. It's not a moral one. It's a perverse one. Perverseness has become the law of the land. Not only is it acceptable behavior, but now it's encoded into the very justice system. These things that go against your word, these things that go against your principles, these things that are not morally correct. Why are you showing me this? And can you see the frustration just oozing out of Habakkuk as he just does not know what to do? He doesn't know what to say. Why is God showing me this? Everywhere he sees in personal relationships to the courts of law, this distresses him. The world just didn't seem to match up with how God intended it to be. And Habakkuk is bothered by this. Are you bothered by it? If you're not bothered by it, you might want to check whether or not you're a believer, because you ought to be bothered by it. You ought to be angry at the things which makes God angry. You ought to be angry at the things going on that don't match up to what God tells us they ought to be. And we ought to get involved. You see, we're called salt and light of the earth, and light exposes the darkness as well as banishes the darkness. There is a passiveness in that it shines forth in such a sense to illuminate what's going on, but it also dispels the darkness. We're also called to be salt, not just to flavor the world that we're in our little corner of it, but salt also preserves that which is good, which is a very an ongoing activity. What are you doing to preserve that which is good? Get involved. Get up, get out, get going. Do something about it. But it's overwhelming. The wicked overwhelm us. And since when did God say only obey me when you're in the majority? But since when did God say only obey me when you're the ones that are in charge? Now, for most of the history of the world, God's people have been outnumbered and have not been in charge. And yet the command still goes forth, be salt and be light. And then God answers in verses 5 and 6. And there's a little bit of ironic humor in here that I get, because God answers Habakkuk, and Habakkuk just said, how long are you going to do this? And you won't answer. I pray and you're not answering me. Well, then God does answer Habakkuk. And he says, look among the nations and watch and be utterly astounded, for I am going to work a work in your days which you will not believe, even though I tell you. You see, this is what I think is ironically funny. First, Habakkuk says, you don't answer me. You're not telling me what's going on. And God says, I'll answer you, but you won't believe it. You want to know, Habakkuk, why I haven't told you? It's because, Habakkuk, you won't believe it if I do. You won't. I wonder sometimes as if that's why we feel as if God is not answering our prayers, and God's saying, if I did, you wouldn't believe it, so why would I waste my time? I'm a good steward. You wouldn't understand it. My ways are so far beyond yours that you wouldn't understand it, and all it would do is make you more frustrated. Have an answer that you don't understand. But he gives a boon to Habakkuk. In verse 6, he tells him anyway, even though he said he's not going to believe it. I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, a bitter, hasty nation which marches through the breadth of the earth to possess dwelling places that are not theirs. I'm going to raise up another country. The answer you're seeking, Habakkuk, is I'm going to raise up a nation that's even worse than yours to judge yours. And Habakkuk's just shaking his head. What? Did I just hear you right? You're going to raise up a people more ungodly than us to judge us? Isn't that backwards? It'd be like God coming to America and say, I'm going to raise up China to march across your country. Venezuela. One of the other horrible human rights nations around the world. So I'm going to use them as an instrument of my judgment on you. We're saying, wait a second. Now you have Christians over in some of those places. How are you going to raise them up to judge us? I mean, we've just been complaining that we're bad and all that, but come on, God, we're not that bad. I mean, we're not them. It's kind of what Habakkuk's thing. We're bad. I mean, I just listed all things we're bad, God, but those guys? Can't believe it. Well, that's exactly what God said he wouldn't believe. Because Habakkuk knows what the Chaldeans are like. And they've been sweeping through everybody, conquering everybody on the face of the earth. Just listen to some of the descriptions of them. They're terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and more fierce than the evening wolves. Their chargers go ahead. Their cavalry comes from afar. They fly as the eagle that hastens to eat. They all come for violence. Their faces are set like the east wind. They gather captives like sand, and they scoff at kings, and princes are scorned by them. They deride every stronghold. They heap up earth and mounds and seize it. Then his mind changes and he transgresses. He commits offense, ascribing this power to his God. Habakkuk's wondering where God's judgment against Judah is going to come from. He says it's going to come from the Chaldeans. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be dreadful. Let me tell you how terrible and dreadful it's going to be. These are the type of people, Habakkuk, that I am going to send to judge you. And when they judge you, they're going to claim they got their power from a false god. And Habakkuk is just dumbfounded. He's got a very lengthy answer from God. And in verses 12 through 17, Habakkuk answers back to God's answer. Now, remember, God had prefaced his answer to Habakkuk by saying, if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. But as a boon, I'm going to go ahead and tell you. And basically, in verses 12 to 17, Habakkuk says, I don't believe it. I cannot believe what I'm hearing from you. You think Habakkuk's frustration level has gotten any lower? I think it's just ratcheted up a few notches. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. God, we're your people. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. You are of purer eyes than to behold evil. You cannot look upon wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Why do you make men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them, and gather them take them up with a hook and gather them in a net, catching them in a dragnet? They rejoice and are glad. They sacrifice and burn incense to their nets because their share is sumptuous and their food plentiful? Are they going to continue to empty their net and continue to slay nations without pity? God, I'm troubled, first of all, why you're not judging Judah. And then, God, I'm troubled by how you're going to judge Judah. God, I don't understand why you're not judging my nation. And then his question goes, God, I am concerned about how you are going to judge my nation. Didn't want you to do that. Really, what do we want God to do here in our country in judgment? Do you want him to rain fire and brimstone down like you did Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, would you target San Francisco or New York or LA or some other city, whichever city, Portland, Seattle, Chicago, whatever city you deem evil and horrible? Would you consign them to eternal damnation right now? Just have God just start raining fire and brimstone indiscriminately down upon them? Would you have our country invaded by the communist Chinese or a coalition of Muslim nations to slaughter and enslave millions of people? Would you have Russia drop a nuclear missile on us? Would you want God to send a plague on us? I think we've already had one type of plague on us this year. Do you really want God to send a more devastating plague like he did to Egypt? What are we really asking for when we cry out like that? I don't think we really know. Instead of crying out for God to be merciful and turn hearts to him and to bring salvation to our people, instead we want to call down judgment. God, you need to judge these filthy, wicked people. God, you got to do something. You got to judge these people. How do you want him to do that? Remember, when God did judge his people, the righteous and unrighteous were not spared. They all suffered. It's a very small remnant of people that were spared, and even of that remnant, there were believers and unbelievers. Not all who went into captivity in Babylon as a remnant were believers. Not all who went to Babylon in captivity who were believers remained believers. We need to be careful what we're praying for, and not let our frustration get us to act foolish. Instead of praying for God to change the hearts and minds of the people and to bring repentance that leads to salvation to them, instead of, God, you got to judge these people. And be careful, because he might answer your prayer like he answered Habakkuk's prayer. Seems that we face crisis times like our country is going through all the wrong way. We withdraw, we scream, we holler, we get angry. We want God to smite the enemy. And then we have to realize that among even those of us who are believers, very, very, very rare is it that has a family that are all believers. That a whole family is all righteous and all pure. And we realize that then we're asking God to condemn our families, our close friends, our colleagues, to that judgment we're so free to put out. Habakkuk tells God, I know who you are, God. I know you're a holy God. I know you're a pure God. I know you cannot look upon evil. I don't understand how you could be using these Chaldeans, these Babylonians, to judge your people. How long will you let them do this? They're cruel people. They gather people up like somebody taking a dragnet across the sea and just scooping up fish. That's how they scoop up nations. We're nothing more than sand to them. And Habakkuk, and I said we're not going to go through the whole book of Habakkuk. You can sit and do this, but in first part of chapter 2, Habakkuk gains some wisdom. Habakkuk does in chapter 2 what he probably should have been doing all along. And it really sets a foundational thing for us as believers to do when we are frustrated with God over a problem. Instead of wanting to call upon God to rain down judgment, he's prayed to God. God has answered, even though God said he wouldn't believe the answer. And Habakkuk says, I can't believe you're going to do what you just said you were going to do. And then Habakkuk says in chapter 2 and verse 1, I will stand my watch and set myself up on the ramparts. I will watch to see what he will say to me and what I am going to answer when I'm corrected. So words of wisdom here. I'm going to stand and watch. I'm going to have to see this, Habakkuk saying, I don't understand what God is up to. And he knew he wouldn't understand. I mean, God told him he wasn't going to understand or believe it. And that's hitting Habakkuk full force. So I'm just going to stand here and I'm going to watch and see how God is going to work this out. I don't know how, I don't know why or how he's going to use the Chaldeans. I don't understand it. But I'm going to watch him do it and see if I can figure it out. That might be some really sound advice to a lot of us. Sit back and watch God. God is not asleep. He doesn't rest. He's already at work. He's always been at work. 2020 hasn't caught him any more by surprise than whatever year Habakkuk was in. You know, all this was coming in advance. He has his plan. Stand and watch. Watch how the Lord is working. Figure out what he's doing. And ask him how he can use you in accomplishing that work. If he wants to use you. He is not going to need you. But the Lord does deign to work through us and has a plan for us to be that salt and light that we've talked about. So stand and watch and see where the opportunities come and take them. I'm going to watch to see what he will say to me. He knows that God is not done speaking to him. And so he's going to watch and wait for God to speak. And here's the real key. And correct me. He says, I'm going to wait and see what God's going to say to me so I will know how to answer when he corrects me. He says, I know my thinking's wrong. I know I'm not understanding what God is up to. I'm so frustrated. And now I'm even more frustrated. And before I say something else stupid, I'm going to wait. I'm going to see how my God's going to answer and correct me so that I know the proper response to that. So I know I'm wrong. That's so missing from so much of us. That humble attitude of saying, I don't understand. So instead of blaming God and thinking God is doing something wrong, we should be saying, I am the one who's not understanding correctly. Somehow my thinking is wrong. And I'll wait for God to correct me so I know how to properly respond to him. Words of wisdom. Words of wisdom you can write down and hang on the wall. If you're frustrated with God and don't understand what he's up to, then sit and listen. Watch and see. Learn how to hear his voice. And enter into that with the mindset of knowing that how you're thinking about what he's doing is flawed. Because you're a finite creature with a finite mind, and he is an infinite, holy God with infinite plans that are far beyond us, but he does like to reason with us. He does like to speak with us. Because for whatever reason, he loves us and cares for us. And he always enters into dialogue with his people. He's a wonderful God. He's a great and mighty God who is personable. He didn't have to answer Habakkuk, but he did. He didn't have to explain elaborately to Habakkuk, but he did. And Habakkuk saying, I'm going to wait and I'm going to watch. And I'm going to listen to him correct me so I know how to properly respond in these times of frustration. You can read through the rest of Habakkuk. It's a wonderful book. Just on a closing note, I remember Jesus telling his disciples, I have so many things to tell you, but you could not understand them right now. I long to pour my heart, my plans out to you, and you just simply can't understand it. I wish you could. I wish you could. Sometimes when we complain about God not speaking to us, he's saying, I long to, but you just don't have the capacity to understand it. So just watch and wait. and look. See the mighty works that I am going to do. And stand, be faithful, stand and watch. I hope this has been a blessing to you. Until next time, may God richly bless you.